They thought he was just another black man with a fake name and a rented car, until he stood up in court and calmly said, "My name is Elijah Monroe. I'm the director of the U.S. Marshals Service." The room froze. And by the time they realized who they were mocking, it was already too late. The courtroom in Little Rock, Arkansas smelled like old wood and bureaucracy. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable, humid, and slow. Ceiling fans spun without conviction, more decorative than functional. The air was thick with routine, the kind that settles in places where people stop expecting surprises. Elijah Monroe sat at the defendant's table, alone, dressed in a charcoal blazer, pressed slacks, and a soft blue shirt without a tie. Wire-rimmed glasses rested on the bridge of his nose, framing eyes that didn't shift, didn't scan, didn't plead. He looked straight ahead, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed in a way that didn't come from arrogance, but clarity. He didn't tap his fingers or glance at the clock. He simply waited, as though time had more to prove to him than he did to it. In the back row, Officer Bradley Knox, square-jawed with a gut that tested the buttons on his uniform, and Deputy Samuel Reed slouched with the entitled air of men who thought they owned the room. Knox nudged Reed with his elbow and tilted his chin toward Elijah. "Look at that," he muttered, too loud for the setting. "Another one trying to play Harvard." Reed chuckled. "Bet he rehearsed 'Yes, Your Honor' in the mirror this morning. Probably Googled it." Their whispers weren't really whispers, and the smirks on their faces said they didn't care who heard them. Elijah didn't blink. He didn't even flinch. He sat there like stone, withered, unmoved, patient. The bailiff called for order. A door opened near the front of the room, and Judge Clarissa Maddox stepped in, robes flowing behind her like a shadow that had somewhere more important to be. She was in her 60s, stern without being cruel, and known for two things: an intolerance for theatrics and a sharp memory. The room rose. Then it sat. The case was called State of Arkansas versus Elijah Monroe. A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The name didn't ring any bells. No local buzz. No scandals tied to it. Just another Tuesday name. Nothing about it suggested headlines. Yet, at the prosecution table stood Michael Denning, 32, all gelled hair and ego. His suit was a little too slim, his tie a little too loud, and his voice carried that dangerous tone of someone who believed that confidence could replace competence. He flipped through his notes like they were a script to a play he'd already won. "Your Honor," Denning began, striding forward, "we're here today because the defendant, Mr. Monroe, failed to comply during a lawful traffic stop 5 days ago. He became evasive, uncooperative, and ultimately had to be restrained." Knox and Reed leaned back, smug. Denning continued, his voice rising just enough to sound righteous. "More disturbing, Your Honor, is that Mr. Monroe provided identification that did not match any known records. In other words, he lied." Judge Maddox raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Monroe, is that true?" Elijah adjusted his glasses with one finger and spoke evenly. "No, Your Honor. It is not." A few people in the gallery snorted quietly, the kind of sound people make when they think they've seen this movie before. A man like that, talking like this, of course he's bluffing. Of course he's trying to outsmart the system. The judge didn't press, yet. 5 days earlier, Highway 167 had stretched ahead of Elijah like a ribbon unraveling into memory. He had been driving for hours. No music. No GPS voice. Just the sound of rubber on asphalt and the steady rhythm of thoughts looping back to the past. He wasn't in a rush, but he wasn't drifting either. He was going somewhere specific, the house he grew up in. Or what remained of it. The property sat on the edge of a rural county line, half swallowed by weeds, the roof sagging like it missed the weight of his father's footsteps. The front porch had collapsed years ago, and Elijah hadn't seen it in nearly a decade. But he remembered every inch. As he passed an abandoned gas station, red and blue lights bloomed in his rearview mirror. A patrol car, previously tucked behind a faded billboard, pulled out and followed closely. Elijah signaled and pulled over without delay. He rolled down the window before the cruiser had even stopped. Officer Knox approached on the driver's side, hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. "License and registration," he barked. No greeting. No explanation. Elijah handed over both. His ID read, Elijah Monroe. Arkansas born. Knox squinted. "You from around here?" "I used to be," Elijah answered. Knox handed the ID to Reed, who had approached the passenger side. "What brings you back?" Knox asked, leaning in. "Visiting old property." Knox frowned. "You always rent cars with Florida plates?" "I travel for work. Rentals come with it." Reed tapped on the passenger window with 2 fingers. "Step out of the vehicle." Elijah's gaze didn't shift. "Is there a reason?" "You match a description," Knox replied vaguely. "Man seen prowling near homes on County Road 5. That's not where I was." "Step out of the car." He'd heard this script before. Different actors, same theater. Elijah stepped out slowly, hands visible. They patted him down. No resistance. No sudden movements. Just breath and stillness. Then came the cuffs. "You're coming to the station," Reed said. "For what?" "You'll find out." Knox grinned. "Unless you'd rather resist." "That your angle?" "No." And just like that, Elijah was in the back seat, watching Arkansas sky darken behind iron bars across the window. At the station, the accusations escalated. Trespassing. Refusing to cooperate. Providing false ID. Elijah remained silent. Composed. The silence unnerved them more than defiance would have. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't beg. "You think you're smarter than us?" Knox had asked. Elijah had said nothing. Reed laughed outside the cell. "Bet he teaches poetry or something. Probably got a philosophy degree. Talks like he's narrating a movie." The holding cell was small. Dim for men inside. One muttered scripture. Another snored. A third paced like he was trying to outrun the bars. And then there was Darnell D. Carson. Mid-20s. Tattoos like scars. Eyes like someone who'd already done more time than he was sentenced for. "You're not from here," D said, sizing him up. "Ain't hard to tell." "No." "What they got you for? Breathing too hard?" Elijah looked at him. "Calm. I speak when it matters." D laughed, then nodded like he understood. "My name's D. Short for Darnell. Most folks in here just call me 24. "Why?" "Because they say I've been booked 24 times. Like I'm part of the furniture." "You proud of that?" D's grin faded. "Nah. Just used to it." He looked around. "But you don't belong in here. I don't know what you do, but it ain't this." Before Elijah could respond, the guard opened the door. "Monroe. Court time." D sat up. "You fighting it?" Elijah stood, steady. "Always." The guard didn't speak to him on the way out. Just kept his pace quick, like he didn't want anyone to see him escorting a man in cuffs who still walked like he didn't need them taken off to command the room. Back in the courtroom, no one knew who Elijah was. Yet. But he wasn't there for introductions. He was there for the reckoning. And the silence that hung in the air wasn't the kind that comes from fear, it was the kind right before a storm breaks. They just didn't know it was already in the room. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2 in the same tone and style? The storm had already begun when Elijah Monroe stepped back into the courtroom. Not the kind you track on radar, but the kind that brews in silence and shatters expectations. Outside, the Arkansas sky had turned a shade darker, but it was nothing compared to the tension building inside that wood-paneled room. Elijah took his seat once again, same calm expression, same steady posture, as if the past 5 days hadn't happened, as if he hadn't spent nearly 40 hours in a holding cell absorbing insult after insult while others measured his worth by the color of his skin and the stillness of his voice. But this time, something had shifted. People noticed how quiet he was, not as a sign of guilt, but as a signal of control. They just didn't understand the scale yet. Michael Denning, the young assistant district attorney, strutted to the center of the room like a man about to deliver a closing argument on cable news. His suit looked tighter today, or maybe it was just the way he wore it, with a smirk and a swagger like he was born to convict. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, even though there was no jury. "We're here to examine a clear case of obstruction. A man pulled over on a routine stop, refuses to answer questions, hands over suspect identification, and acts in a manner meant to confuse and evade." He paused, scanning the courtroom like a performer gauging his audience. "We have the testimony of 2 experienced officers, whose judgment we trust, and we have a defendant who refuses to even retain counsel." There were a few chuckles. Not from Elijah. Not from the judge. Just from the same people who always laughed when they thought they were ahead. Judge Maddox turned to Elijah. "Mr. Monroe, you're choosing to represent yourself?" Elijah stood slowly, respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor." She studied him, trying to read the face behind the glasses. "Very well. Mr. Denning, you may proceed." Denning wasted no time calling his first witness, Officer Bradley Knox. Knox walked to the stand like a man who had practiced his story in front of a bathroom mirror. He raised his right hand, took the oath, and leaned into the microphone like it owed him something. "We observed the suspect, the defendant, driving slowly through a residential area. Out-of-state plates. Matching a report from earlier that day about suspicious activity. And what happened when you pulled him over?" "He was cold. Distant. Wouldn't say much. Gave me an ID that didn't ping anything in the system. He acted like he had something to hide." "Did he raise his voice?" "No." "Did he threaten you?" "No, but he had that attitude, you know." Denning nodded like that was proof enough. "And you felt he was providing false information?" "Absolutely." Elijah stood for his cross-examination. He didn't walk fast. He didn't pace. He moved like a man with time on his side. "Officer Knox," he began. "You said I gave you my ID?" "Correct." "Did it have my name?" "Yes." "My photo?" "Yeah." "So the ID matched my face and included a verifiable name. It didn't show up in the system. Maybe your system wasn't connected to the right database." Knox shifted. "That's not on us." "I agree," Elijah said. "It's on the assumptions you made after." Denning objected. "Speculation." Withdrawn, Elijah said smoothly, turning back to the judge. "No further questions." Next was Deputy Samuel Reed. Same story. Same tone. Same quiet code words. "He gave me that look," Reed said. "The kind of guy who thinks he's above being questioned. Talked calm, but it was calculated." "Calculated how?" Denning asked. "Like a professor trying to play innocent. Like he knew how to use words to make us look bad." Elijah rose again. "Deputy Reed," he said, "did I ever refuse a lawful order? You asked why you were being detained. Is that illegal? No. Did I resist being searched? No. Did I raise my voice, insult you, or make any physical move against you? No. So your concern was with my tone." Reed hesitated. "It's hard to explain. Was it the words I used or the way I said them?" Reed didn't answer. Elijah looked to the judge. No further questions. The courtroom felt different now. Less sure. Less entertained. Judge Maddox leaned forward. "Mr. Monroe, do you have any documentation relevant to this case?" Elijah reached into his briefcase and pulled out 3 folders. "I do, Your Honor." He laid them on the table. "This is the deed to the property I was visiting. My name is on it. Has been for 6 years. This is my birth certificate. This, he held up a third folder, is a federal clearance letter, renewed 3 months ago. He opened it. Top-level security. Signed by the Department of Justice. Denning stood abruptly. Why would a man carry that kind of paperwork in his car? Elijah didn't raise his voice. Because I know exactly what country I live in. The room fell silent. It wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a punch landing without motion. Judge Maddox blinked slowly, then glanced at the bailiff. Mr. Monroe, for the record, would you please state your occupation? Elijah paused. Not for effect, but like someone weighing the cost of truth. He straightened his glasses. My name is Elijah Monroe. I'm the director of the United States Marshals Service. No one moved. Knox's face drained of color. Reed looked like he'd swallowed a lit cigarette. Denning stammered. Your Honor, this can't. Maddox raised a hand. Bailiff, verify immediately. The bailiff left the room in a near run. The judge turned back to Elijah. You didn't disclose this earlier. Why? Because I didn't come here as a director, Elijah said. I came here as a citizen. To see with my own eyes what people across this country keep reporting to my office. Denning tried to recover. Even so, his identity doesn't change the facts, it changes everything, Maddox snapped. Sit down, Mr. Denning. Denning sat. Rigid. Flushed. The bailiff returned moments later, a printed sheet in his hand. He whispered in the judge's ear. She nodded. Confirmed, she said. Appointed 6 months ago. Senate confirmed. Clearance Tier 5. Director of the U.S. Marshals Service. The gallery buzzed, but no one dared speak above a whisper. Judge Maddox turned to Denning. You are dismissed from this case. Effective immediately. Then to Knox and Reed. Leave your badges on the table and wait outside. They didn't argue. Didn't speak. Just stood, hollow, sweating, and left. Judge Maddox looked back at Elijah. Do you wish to press charges? Elijah exhaled. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to fix something. And with that, the courtroom knew. This wasn't a story about a traffic stop. This was a test. And they'd failed it, until the man they misjudged gave them a second chance. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 3 in the same tone and detail? By the time Elijah Monroe stepped out of the courthouse, the sun was already high and the air had shifted. Not just in temperature, but in tone. The courtroom behind him had fallen quiet in the aftermath of a revelation that still pulsed like an aftershock through the city of Little Rock, and soon, through the entire nation. Reporters waited at the steps, cameras clicking, microphones raised, but Elijah walked past them with the same calm composure he had carried into that courtroom. No press conference. No speech. No headline-grabbing statement. He didn't need one. The truth had spoken loud enough inside those walls, and the silence that followed had said the rest. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Local news couldn't cover it fast enough. National outlets picked it up within hours. By sunrise, Elijah's name was on every major network. U.S. Marshals Director detained without cause. Top law enforcement official mistaken for criminal and racial profiling case. The man they laughed at was the man in charge. The footage of the courtroom was limited. Arkansas law prohibited full video in many local trials, but someone had caught the hallway scene outside, Elijah walking calmly past Denning, who sat slumped on a bench with his tie loosened and his palms pressed together like a man praying for his career. In another clip, 2 uniformed officers, Knox and Reed, removed their badges and placed them on a courthouse table. The image went viral. 2 badges, 1 man, and a system caught in the act of revealing itself. Inside police headquarters, damage control began before sunrise. The chief released a cautious statement citing miscommunication and procedural gaps. But it wasn't enough. Knox and Reed were suspended by noon. By the end of the week, both were terminated after internal review. Their prior arrests, over 40 in total, were opened for investigation. A half-dozen defense attorneys filed motions for dismissal within 48 hours. At least 3 cases were overturned in the following 2 weeks. Michael Denning, who had once boasted about his win record in small-town coffee shops, submitted his resignation quietly, without a press release. A week later, he was photographed leaving the county building with a cardboard box in his arms and his face turned away from the cameras. As for Judge Maddox, she didn't issue a statement to the press, but she sent Elijah a handwritten letter, 1 page, signed in blue ink. She acknowledged her assumptions, apologized for the initial tone of the courtroom, and thanked him for handling the situation with grace. Elijah never replied. Not out of arrogance. Not out of resentment. But because he had already moved on. He was back in Washington, D.C. before the week was over, back in the modest but secure brick building that housed the director's office of the U.S. Marshals Service. Back to the long hours and quiet decisions. Back to reading letters from citizens who wrote about their sons being stopped too many times, their daughters being watched too closely, and their neighbors being searched without cause. Back to the cases that didn't go viral. He didn't want the fame. He wanted the system to see itself honestly flawed, fallible, and desperately overdue for reform. That courtroom in Arkansas wasn't a detour. It was the destination. Because Elijah had gone there not to be recognized, but to recognize. To verify what he already suspected. To feel it. Not as a director, but as a black man in a rented sedan with out-of-state plates. What he saw was worse than protocol. It was instinct. 2 officers who saw suspicion where there was none. A prosecutor who saw an easy win. A system that, without confirmation of power or status, treated him like a problem to be processed. And he had let it happen. Willingly. Because some truths only reveal themselves when you're silent long enough for people to show you who they are. In the months that followed, the Department of Justice initiated a formal investigation into regional law enforcement practices in Pulaski County. Sensitivity training mandates were introduced. A task force on racial bias in policing was launched, with Elijah overseeing its direction personally. Quietly. Intentionally. He never once referenced his case. Because he didn't see it as his. He saw it as everyone's. The story followed him for a while. People asked for interviews, books, documentaries. He declined them all. There was work to be done, and that work didn't happen in studios or bestseller lists. It happened in briefings, in policy rewrites, and deep dives into statistical data about traffic stops and arrest disparities. And still, letters came. Not just from citizens, but from officers, some apologizing, some defending, some just confused. He read them all. Responded to none. His response was the work. The ones who mattered would feel it there. Meanwhile, the people who laughed at him that day, the smirks in the courtroom, the folded arms, the condescension, they remembered. Because Elijah hadn't shouted. He hadn't slammed a fist or thrown a title like a badge. He'd simply spoken clearly. Slowly. And in doing so, dismantled an entire illusion. And that was what lingered most. Not the twist. Not the reveal. But the restraint. The way a man could carry power without announcing it. And speak truth without raising his voice. In the end, the story didn't belong to him. It belonged to anyone who had ever been stopped without cause. Anyone who had ever been told they looked out of place. Anyone who had sat in silence while others wrote their story for them. It belonged to the ones who didn't have 3 forms of ID in their glove compartment just in case. To the ones who didn't get to reveal a title that made the room freeze. To the ones who were cuffed, silenced, forgotten. Elijah carried them in every step out of that courthouse. And when he got home, really home, to the office where the decisions were made, he wrote a single sentence on the whiteboard behind his desk. A reminder. A warning. A truth. It's not the badge or title that makes a man worthy of respect, it's how he treats others when no one's watching. And with that, he picked up the phone. Not for the media. Not for revenge. But for change. Because justice doesn't end when the cameras shut off. That's when it begins. What happened to Elijah Monroe isn't just a story. It's a mirror, a sobering reflection of what still lingers beneath the surface of our justice system. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash his title. He didn't ask for special treatment. And yet, it wasn't until those in power learned who he was that they even considered the possibility that a mistake had been made. That's the problem. Respect in this country, far too often, is conditional. It's extended after credentials are verified, after backgrounds are confirmed, after silence is mistaken for submission. But true justice? Real dignity? They aren't earned through titles or resumes, they're owed from the start. Elijah's story teaches us something vital. The loudest person in the room isn't always right, and the quietest isn't always wrong. Sometimes, strength looks like stillness. Sometimes, courage sounds like calm. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is wait for the truth to catch up. This story is a wake-up call, not just for officers or prosecutors, but for all of us. For every neighbor who jumps to conclusions. For every judge who assumes based on appearance. For every citizen who chooses comfort over confrontation with hard truths. The system won't change just because one man in a suit proved them wrong. It'll change when ordinary people demand better, not just for themselves, but for others, especially those who don't have a title that makes the room go silent. So here's my advice to you, the listener. Speak when it matters. Ask questions when others stay quiet. Don't be so quick to judge the person in front of you, whether in a courtroom, on a street corner, or in the seat next to you on a plane. Because the moment you assume someone's worth based on how they look, what they drive, or how they speak, you risk getting the whole story wrong. And if you ever find yourself underestimated, mislabeled, or dismissed, remember Elijah Monroe. And stand your ground.